The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel outside, and Elinor's heart jumped into her throat. She knew that sound. She knew what it meant. Someone important was arriving at Thornfield Manor, and that meant only one thing for her. "Go now." Lady Beatrix's voice was sharp as a blade, cutting through the quiet of the upstairs hallway. She gripped Elinor's arm and pulled her toward the narrow servants' staircase at the back of the house. "You know the rule. You are not seen. You are not heard. If I hear one sound from you while our guest is here, you will regret it." Elinor did not argue. She never argued. 18 years of living in this house had taught her that arguing only made things worse. She let her aunt pull her up the stairs, past the portraits of ancestors she was never allowed to claim as her own, past the long mirror that showed her reflection for only a second before she looked away. She had learned not to look at herself too long. It only reminded her of things she could not have. At the top of the stairs, Lady Beatrix stopped and turned to face her. Her eyes, cold and gray, studied Elinor from head to toe, as if checking for anything that might give her away. "Stay in your room. Do not come down. Do not go near the windows. I mean it this time, Elinor. This is not like the other visits." "Who is coming?" Elinor asked quietly. Her aunt's jaw tightened. "The Duke of Wardour." The name meant nothing to Elinor at first, but she saw something flicker across her aunt's face when she said it. Fear, maybe, or something close to it. Lady Beatrix was not a woman who feared easily. She ruled Thornfield Manor with a grip so tight that even the servants moved carefully around her, afraid to make a wrong step. To see her afraid, even for a moment, was strange. "Why does it matter so much who sees me?" Elinor asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. She had asked it 100 times before in 100 different ways, and she had never once received a real answer. "Because it matters," her aunt snapped. "Because I say it matters. Now go to your room and stay there until I send for you." Elinor turned and walked down the hallway toward the small room at the end, the one that had been hers for as long as she could remember. It was not a grand room. It did not have the tall windows or the soft carpets of the other bedrooms in the house. It was plain and small, tucked away where visitors would never think to look. She had always told herself that she did not mind. She had told herself that so many times that she almost believed it. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the house coming alive below her. Footsteps hurried across the wooden floors. Voices called out instructions. Somewhere a door opened and closed, and she heard the clear, deep voice of a man she did not recognize greeting someone in the front hall. "The Duke of Wardour." Elinor had heard the name before, whispered among the servants when they thought she could not hear. He was said to be one of the wealthiest men in the county, with land that stretched for miles and a house so large it had its own village nearby. He was also said to be unmarried, which made him the subject of much interest among the mothers of eligible young women. Elinor had never expected to think of him as anything more than a name attached to gossip. She certainly never expected him to come to Thornfield Manor. She moved to her small window and looked down at the drive below. A fine black carriage stood in front of the house, its horses still breathing hard from the journey. A tall man was walking toward the front doors, his coat dark and well-made, his steps confident in a way that told her he was used to being welcomed wherever he went. She could not see his face from this angle, but something about the way he carried himself made her curious in a way she did not expect. She should not have been curious. She knew that. Curiosity had never done her any good in this house, but she found herself watching until he disappeared through the front doors, and even after he was gone from sight, she stayed at the window a moment longer, wondering what kind of man he was. A knock came at her door, sharp and quick. It was Hannah, one of the younger maids, her face flushed from running up the stairs. "Lady Beatrix wants you to stay quiet," Hannah whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "She says the Duke is staying for tea, maybe longer. She says you're not to make a sound." "I heard her the first time," Elinor said, trying to keep her voice light, though something inside her felt tight and uncertain. Hannah lingered in the doorway, twisting her apron in her hands. "He's a fine-looking gentleman," she said, almost shyly. "Tall, serious sort of face, but kind eyes, I think. Not like some of the lords who come through here." Elinor almost smiled. Hannah always had something to say about the visitors who came to the manor, comparing their manners and their clothes and their faces as if she were judging a contest. It was one of the few small joys Elinor had, listening to Hannah's observations, since she was never allowed to make any of her own in person. "Go on now," Elinor said gently, "before my aunt notices you're gone too long." Hannah nodded and hurried away, leaving Elinor alone again with the murmur of voices rising faintly from below. She sat back down on her bed and folded her hands in her lap, trying to settle the strange restlessness that had crept into her chest. It was not the first time she had been hidden away for a visitor. It would not be the last. She told herself this was nothing new, nothing to think twice about. But something about today felt different, though she could not have said why. Time passed slowly in her small room, the afternoon light shifting across the floor as she waited. She tried to read, but the words on the page blurred together, her mind wandering back to the voices downstairs. She caught fragments of conversation sometimes when the wind was right and her window was cracked open just enough. She heard her aunt's voice, smooth and practiced, the voice she used only for guests of importance. She heard the low, even tones of the Duke, though she could not make out his words. She thought of her mother then, as she often did in quiet moments like this. She barely remembered her, only a soft voice and the smell of lavender, and a portrait that used to hang in the east hallway before it was taken down and never spoken of again. She did not know why her mother had died so young, or why her father, whom she remembered even less, had left her in the care of an aunt who seemed to resent her very existence. No one had ever explained it to her. Questions about her parents were met with silence, or worse, with the kind of anger that made her stop asking. She wondered, not for the first time, what she had done to deserve a life spent behind curtains and closed doors. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled her from her thoughts. She sat up straight, listening carefully. The footsteps were heavier than Hannah's light steps, more deliberate. They stopped somewhere down the hallway, near her aunt's private sitting room, and she heard the low murmur of voices again, though closer now. She crept to her door and pressed her ear against the wood, a habit she had developed over years of being told nothing and having to learn things for herself. She could just make out her aunt's voice, tight with tension. "There is nothing more to discuss, Your Grace. The house is small and my niece keeps to herself. She is of no interest to anyone." Elinor's breath caught. They were talking about her. The Duke's reply was too quiet for her to hear clearly, but something in the rhythm of his voice suggested he was not satisfied with her aunt's answer. There was a pause, and then her aunt spoke again, her voice higher this time, almost brittle. "I assure you, there is no need to trouble yourself with matters that do not concern you." Elinor pulled back from the door, her heart pounding. Why would the Duke ask about her at all? He did not know her. He had never even seen her as far as she knew. Unless someone had mentioned her, some careless word from a servant or a passing comment that had caught his attention. She sat back down on her bed, her mind racing with questions she had no way to answer. The voices moved away from her door, back toward the main part of the house, and she was left once again with only silence and her own uncertain thoughts. The afternoon stretched on, and Elinor grew restless in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel. She was used to waiting. She was used to being forgotten in small rooms while life happened downstairs without her. But today, for reasons she could not explain, the waiting felt unbearable. She thought about the window again, about the tall man she had seen walking toward the house with such quiet confidence. She wondered what he looked like up close, whether his eyes really were kind as Hannah had said, or whether that was just a maid's fanciful imagination. She wondered what he had asked her aunt, and why her aunt had sounded so unsettled by the question. A soft knock came at her door again, different from Hannah's quick rap. This one was slower, more careful. Elinor rose and opened it to find not Hannah, but Clara, her aunt's own daughter, standing in the hallway with an odd look on her face. Clara was 2 years older than Elinor and had never shown her much warmth, though she had never been openly cruel either. She simply treated Elinor the way one might treat a piece of furniture that had always been in the house but was never quite noticed. Today, however, there was something different in her expression, something almost curious. "Mother wants you to come down to the drawing room," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of surprise, as if she herself could not quite believe the words she was speaking. Elinor stared at her. "Come down now." "The Duke asked for you specifically," Clara said. "Mother tried to talk him out of it, but he would not be moved. She says you're to come at once and you're to behave yourself." Clara's eyes flicked over Elinor's simple dress, her plain hair, with a look that was not quite unkind but not quite sympathetic either. "I don't know what he wants with you, just don't embarrass the family." Elinor's pulse quickened, a strange mixture of fear and something else, something she could not name, rising in her chest. For years she had been hidden, tucked away like a secret too shameful to reveal. Now, for the first time she could remember, someone important was asking to see her by name. She smoothed the front of her dress with trembling hands, wishing she had something finer to wear, though she pushed the thought aside almost as quickly as it came. It did not matter what she wore. What mattered was what waited for her downstairs, in the drawing room, where her aunt's carefully guarded secret was about to be tested in a way it never had before. "Clara," she said quietly before her cousin could turn away, "do you know why he asked for me?" Clara paused, something almost like sympathy crossing her face for the briefest moment. "No," she admitted, "but Mother looked more frightened than I've ever seen her. Whatever it is, it's not nothing. Elinor, be careful." With that warning hanging in the air between them, Clara turned and walked back down the hallway, leaving Elinor alone at the top of the stairs. Below her, she could hear the faint murmur of voices from the drawing room, and somewhere among them, a man who had, without even meeting her, already begun to change everything. Elinor took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and began to walk down the stairs toward whatever was waiting for her. The drawing room felt smaller than Elinor remembered as she stepped through the doorway, though she knew it was simply her own nerves making the walls seem to press in around her. The afternoon light fell in long golden bars across the carpet, and standing near the tall window, with his back to her at first, was a man taller than any she had seen before. He turned when he heard her enter, and for a moment Elinor forgot how to breathe. Hannah had been right. His eyes were kind, a deep gray that seemed to soften the sharp lines of his face, though there was something searching in his gaze too, something that made her feel as if he were looking past her plain dress and her downturned eyes to something else entirely. He was younger than she had expected, though certainly older than herself, with dark hair swept back neatly and the kind of bearing that came from a lifetime of never having to ask twice for anything. "Your Grace," Lady Beatrix said quickly, stepping between them as if she could shield Elinor from his gaze even now. "This is my niece, Elinor. She rarely comes downstairs. She is not accustomed to company." "So I understand," the Duke said, his voice calm and even though his eyes never left Elinor's face. "Yet you look perfectly capable of managing a simple introduction, Miss Elinor." Elinor curtsied, her cheeks warm. "Your Grace," she said softly, unsure of what else was expected of her. She had watched other young women greet important guests from a distance, through cracked doors and hidden corners, but she had never once been the one doing the greeting. "Please sit," the Duke said, gesturing toward the chairs near the window, though it was not his place to offer such an invitation in someone else's home. Lady Beatrix's mouth tightened, but she said nothing, and Elinor understood in that moment that whatever power her aunt normally held in this house, it did not extend to overruling a duke in his own request. Elinor sat carefully on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap, aware of her aunt hovering nearby like a hawk watching for the smallest mistake. Clara had taken a seat across the room, her curiosity plain on her face, while a maid moved quietly at the edges of the room, refreshing the tea that had gone cold during whatever conversation had taken place before Elinor arrived. "Tell me, Miss Elinor," the Duke said, settling into the chair across from her with an ease that suggested he was in no hurry at all, "how long have you lived at Thornfield Manor?" "As long as I can remember, Your Grace," Elinor answered honestly, "since I was very young." "And your parents?" The question hung in the air, and Elinor felt her aunt stiffen beside her. "My mother passed away when I was small," Elinor said carefully, choosing her words the way she always did when this subject arose. "I do not remember much of my father." "I see." The Duke's eyes flickered briefly to Lady Beatrix, something unreadable passing across his face before he turned his attention back to Elinor. "It is a fine house, large enough for a family of considerable size, and yet I understand you keep mostly to your own quarters." "I prefer the quiet," Elinor said, though it was only half true. She had learned to tell herself she preferred it, because the alternative, admitting how much she longed to be included, was far too painful to sit with. "A shame," the Duke said simply. "A house this fine should not go unappreciated by all who live in it." Lady Beatrix cleared her throat sharply. "Your Grace, I am sure you did not travel all this way to discuss my niece's living arrangements. You mentioned business concerning the eastern boundary of the estate. Perhaps we might return to that matter." "Of course," the Duke said smoothly, though Elinor noticed he did not look away from her immediately, as if committing something about her face to memory before turning his attention to her aunt. "The boundary dispute can certainly wait until I have finished my tea, however." The conversation shifted, as her aunt clearly hoped it would, into matters of land and neighboring properties, subjects Elinor knew nothing about and had no reason to comment on. She sat quietly, sipping the tea that had been poured for her, listening more than speaking, though she felt the Duke's attention return to her again and again throughout the conversation, brief glances that seemed to carry more curiosity than the topic at hand deserved. It was during a pause in the discussion, while Lady Beatrix was occupied instructing the maid on some small matter, that the Duke leaned slightly toward Elinor and spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear. "Forgive my directness, Miss Elinor, but you remind me strongly of someone I once knew. A portrait, actually, that used to hang in a house not far from here. I wonder if you might know anything of a woman named Isabel." The name struck Elinor like a physical blow. She had not heard her mother's name spoken aloud in years, not since she was a small child, and had asked too many questions about the portrait that once hung in the east hallway before it disappeared without explanation. "Isabel was my mother's name," Elinor whispered, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a flicker of realization that he quickly masked, though not quickly enough for Elinor to miss it entirely. "Is that so?" he said quietly, more to himself than to her, before Lady Beatrix's voice cut sharply across the room. "Elinor, would you fetch more sugar for our guest? The bowl seems to have run empty." It was not empty. Elinor could see clearly from where she sat that the sugar bowl was still half full, but she understood the command for what it was, an excuse to remove her from the room, from the conversation, from whatever thread the Duke had just begun to pull. She rose without argument, as she always did, and made her way toward the door. "Miss Elinor," the Duke said, rising as she passed, a small courtesy that seemed to surprise even her aunt. "It was a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance." Finally, the word lingered in her mind as she walked from the room, as if he had been waiting, searching, for this meeting for far longer than the length of one afternoon's visit. In the hallway, away from the watchful eyes of the drawing-room, Elinor allowed herself a moment to lean against the wall and catch her breath. Her mother's name, spoken by a stranger who claimed to have seen her portrait somewhere. It made no sense. As far as she knew, her mother had never lived anywhere but Thornfield Manor, not in any house the Duke of Wardour might have visited. Unless her aunt had lied to her about that too. She made her way to the kitchen, more to give herself time to think than because she had any real intention of fetching sugar that was not needed. The kitchen was warm and busy, the cook and two maids moving between the stove and the long wooden table, and Elinor found a quiet corner where she could stand unnoticed for a few precious minutes. "You look pale, miss," said Mrs. Ferris, the cook, glancing up from the bread she was kneading. "Everything all right up there with the fine company?" "I'm not sure," Elinor admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. Mrs. Ferris had always been kinder to her than most in the house, slipping her extra portions when Lady Beatrix was not looking, offering small comforts that no one else thought to give. The Duke asked about my mother. Mrs. Ferris's hands stilled on the bread dough just for a moment before she resumed her kneading with perhaps a touch more force than necessary. Did he now? You knew my mother, didn't you? Elinor asked, stepping closer. You've worked here longer than anyone else. You must remember her. The cook's face grew guarded, the warmth that usually lived there dimming slightly. It's not my place to speak on family matters, miss. Your aunt would have my position if I said too much. Please, Elinor said, and something in her voice must have carried the weight of years of unanswered questions, because Mrs. Ferris set down her dough and wiped her hands on her apron, glancing toward the kitchen door as if checking for anyone who might overhear. Your mother was a lovely woman, she said quietly, kind to everyone from the stable boys to the finest guests. She used to sing while she walked through the gardens. I remember that much clear as day. She paused, something sorrowful crossing her weathered face. There was talk back then that she'd married beneath what your aunt thought proper, and then there was talk of another sort entirely, closer to the end. But it's not my place, Miss Elinor, truly it isn't. What kind of talk? Elinor pressed, desperate now for even a single true thing about the mother she barely remembered. Before Mrs. Ferris could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside the kitchen, quick and purposeful. Elinor recognized the rhythm of her aunt's walk immediately, and Mrs. Ferris's face closed like a shutting door as she snatched up the sugar bowl, filled it hastily, and pressed it into Elinor's hands. Best get back upstairs, miss, she said, her voice returning to its usual brisk, careful tone. Wouldn't do to keep your aunt waiting. Elinor carried the sugar back toward the drawing room, her mind spinning with the fragments Mrs. Ferris had given her. Talk of a marriage beneath her mother's station. Talk of something else near the end, something the cook clearly did not want to speak of within these walls. And now a duke who claimed to know her mother's face from a portrait in some other house entirely. None of it fit together neatly, but for the first time in her life, Elinor felt as though the careful walls her aunt had built around her past were beginning to crack. When she returned to the drawing room, the conversation had moved on entirely, back to matters of land and boundaries that meant nothing to her. But the Duke's eyes found hers the moment she entered, and though he said nothing more that afternoon about her mother, she understood from the steady, thoughtful way he watched her that he had not forgotten either. The visit drew to its natural end an hour later, the Duke rising to take his leave with the same easy grace he had arrived with. Lady Beatrix walked him to the front doors herself, her relief at his departure barely concealed beneath her polite farewells. Elinor remained in the drawing room, watching through the window as the Duke paused beside his carriage, glancing back up at the house. For a brief moment, his gaze found her window, though she was certain he could not have known exactly where she stood. Still, something in the way he looked toward the house, searching, made her step back from the glass, her heart racing with a feeling she could not name. He climbed into his carriage and it pulled away down the long drive, but Elinor remained at the window long after it had disappeared from sight, turning over every word he had spoken, every glance he had given her, wondering what had brought him to Thornfield Manor and whether he intended to return. She did not have to wonder long. 2 days later, a letter arrived addressed to Lady Beatrix, and though Elinor never saw its contents, she watched her aunt's face grow pale as she read it, watched her hands tremble as she folded the paper, and threw it into the fire before any of the servants could catch even a glimpse of what it said. Whatever the letter contained, it was clear that the Duke of Wardour had no intention of letting the matter rest, and Elinor found herself, for the first time in her sheltered life, waiting eagerly for whatever might come next. The days after the Duke's visit passed differently than any Elinor had known before. Lady Beatrix moved through the house with a new sharpness in her voice, snapping at servants for small mistakes, watching Elinor with an intensity that made the younger woman feel as though she were being studied for signs of danger. The burned letter was never mentioned, and Elinor knew better than to ask about it directly, though she noticed her aunt writing letters of her own late into the night, the study door locked tight against curious eyes. It was Clara, unexpectedly, who let something slip a week later. The two cousins rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, but Clara had always enjoyed a bit of gossip more than she enjoyed keeping her mother's secrets, and one afternoon, while helping Elinor sort linens in the upstairs hall, she could not resist sharing what she had overheard. "Mother's been writing to her solicitor," Clara said quietly, glancing down the hallway to be sure they were alone. "I heard her mention your name to him and something about old records. She's frightened of something, Elinor. I've never seen her so on edge." "Did she say what kind of records?" Elinor asked, her hands stilling over the folded linens. Clara shook her head. "No, but I heard her say the word marriage more than once." "And your mother's name, too." Elinor's pulse quickened. Marriage records. Her mother's name. It was too similar to what Mrs. Ferris had told her days before to be a coincidence, and she found herself more determined than ever to uncover whatever truth her aunt had spent so many years burying. That evening, after the house had grown quiet and the servants had retired to their own quarters, Elinor slipped from her room with a small candle in hand, making her way toward the attic stairs at the far end of the house. She had been to the attic only a handful of times in her life, always sent to fetch some forgotten item during her aunt's occasional bouts of cleaning, but she remembered enough of its layout to navigate the dark space without too much difficulty. The attic smelled of dust and old wood, filled with trunks and furniture covered in white cloth, remnants of a family history that had been packed away and forgotten. Elinor moved carefully between the shapes, her candle casting long shadows across the sloped ceiling, searching for anything that might hold answers to the questions that had haunted her for years. It took nearly an hour of careful searching before she found it, tucked behind an old wardrobe in the far corner of the attic. A small wooden trunk with a faded set of initials carved into the lid. It. Isabel Thornfield. Her mother's initials, though Elinor had never before considered that her mother might have shared the Thornfield name at all. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid, revealing a collection of items that had clearly been hidden away deliberately rather than simply forgotten. There were letters, tied together with faded ribbon. There was a small portrait, wrapped carefully in cloth, which Elinor unwrapped with trembling fingers to reveal a young woman with soft brown eyes and a gentle smile, so similar to her own reflection that she felt tears spring unbidden to her eyes. This was her mother. This was the face she had spent so many years trying to remember, and never quite could. Beneath the portrait, wrapped in a piece of yellowed cloth, was a folded document that Elinor recognized immediately as a marriage certificate, though the ink had faded with age. She unfolded it carefully, holding her candle closer to read the names written there. Isabel Marchant and Edmund Thornfield. Edmund Thornfield. The same name as the late Lord Thornfield, the man Elinor had always understood to be her uncle by marriage, Lady Beatrix's late husband, and the true master of the house before his death many years ago. But this certificate suggested something else entirely, something that made Elinor's head spin as she tried to make sense of what she was reading. Unless there had been two men named Edmund Thornfield, which seemed unlikely in a family as small as this one, the document suggested that her mother had been married to the very man Elinor had always believed to be her aunt's husband. Her hands trembling, Elinor set the certificate aside and reached for the bundle of letters, untying the faded ribbon with careful fingers. The first letter she unfolded was written in a hand she did not recognize, addressed to her mother in words filled with tenderness and longing. "My dearest Isabel," it began, though Elinor made herself stop reading after only a few lines, unable to bear the intimacy of words never meant for her eyes, at least not yet. She set the letter aside, her mind racing with implications she could barely begin to untangle. If her mother had truly been married to Edmund Thornfield, then Elinor was not simply a niece taken in out of family obligation, tucked away and hidden out of embarrassment for reasons never explained. She was something else entirely. She might be the true daughter of the house, with a claim to Thornfield Manor that far outweighed anything Lady Beatrix or Clara could claim for themselves. It was too much to process alone, in the dark, dusty silence of the attic. Elinor carefully wrapped the portrait and the certificate back in their cloth, tucking the letters beneath them, and closed the trunk gently, though her mind continued to race with everything she had discovered. She was halfway back across the attic, her candle flickering with each careful step, when a sound below made her freeze in place. Footsteps, moving with purpose, coming up the attic stairs. There was no time to hide the trunk again. No time to do anything but blow out her candle and press herself into the shadows behind a large piece of covered furniture, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it must be audible in the silence. The attic door creaked open, and lamplight spilled across the floor as Lady Beatrix stepped inside, her face set in hard, determined lines. She moved directly toward the corner where the trunk sat, as if she had known exactly where to find it, and Elinor understood with a sinking heart that her aunt must have suspected, perhaps for days, that she might come looking. "I know you're here, Elinor," Lady Beatrix said into the darkness, her voice cold and controlled in a way that frightened Elinor more than shouting ever could have. "There is no use hiding. I saw the light from your candle through the window as I crossed the garden." Elinor stepped out from behind the furniture, her legs trembling beneath her, though she forced herself to stand tall. There was no point in pretending now. Her aunt already knew. "Is it true?" Elinor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Was my mother married to Lord Thornfield?" Something in her aunt's face flickered, a brief crack in the careful composure she had maintained for so many years, before it hardened again into something colder and more distant than Elinor had ever seen. "You had no right to come up here," Lady Beatrix said, ignoring the question entirely. "This attic, everything in it, belongs to this family, and you are not to touch it again." "I am part of this family," Elinor said, the words rushing out before she could stop them, years of suppressed frustration finally finding their voice. "Aren't I? That marriage certificate has my mother's name and Lord Thornfield's name written together. Tell me the truth. Please, Aunt Beatrix, I deserve to know." For a long moment Lady Beatrix said nothing, her eyes fixed on the trunk in the corner as if she could will it out of existence through sheer force of anger. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost weary, though no less firm. "You deserve nothing from me but the roof over your head and the food on your table, both of which I have provided out of a kindness you have never once appreciated," she said. "Whatever you think you understand from old papers in a dusty trunk, you understand nothing at all. This conversation is finished." "But the Duke asked about my mother," Elinor pressed, refusing to let the matter drop now that she had come so close to answers she had sought her entire life. "He recognized her name. That cannot be a coincidence." Something in her aunt's expression shifted again at the mention of the Duke. A flicker of genuine fear that Elinor had never seen before, not even in their most difficult moments together. "The Duke of Wardour has no business involving himself in matters that do not concern him," Lady Beatrix said sharply. "And you would do well to remember your place, Elinor, before you say something you cannot take back." "My place," Elinor repeated softly. "You've kept me hidden my entire life, and I never understood why. Now I begin to understand, and you want me to simply forget what I've found and go back to my room as though nothing has changed." "That is precisely what I want," Lady Beatrix said, stepping closer, her voice dropping to something almost threatening in its quiet intensity. "And you will do it, Elinor, because you have nowhere else to go and no one else in this world who will take you in. Do you understand me? Whatever fantasies you have built from old papers, they mean nothing without my support, and I can withdraw that support at any moment I choose." The threat hung heavy in the dusty air between them, and Elinor felt the familiar weight of powerlessness settle back over her shoulders, the same feeling that had defined her entire existence within these walls. Her aunt was right, in the most practical sense. She had no money of her own, no other family to turn to, no way to survive outside the boundaries of Thornfield Manor if her aunt truly decided to cast her out. But something had changed in her tonight, even beneath the weight of that fear. She had seen her mother's face for the first time in memory. She had read her mother's name beside a name that suggested a truth far different from the one she had been told her entire life. That knowledge could not be taken back, no matter how firmly her aunt commanded her to forget it. "I will not speak of this to anyone," Elinor said quietly, choosing her words carefully, aware that this was not the moment to fight a battle she could not yet win. But I will not forget it either. Lady Beatrix's eyes narrowed, studying her niece with an expression that mixed calculation with something almost like respect, though she would never have admitted to feeling such a thing. "Go to your room," she said finally. "We will speak no more of this tonight." Elinor obeyed, walking past her aunt and down the attic stairs, leaving the trunk and its secrets behind in the darkness. But her mind was already working, turning over everything she had learned, searching for a way forward that did not depend entirely on her aunt's mercy. She thought of the Duke, of the careful, searching way he had looked at her during his visit, of the question he had asked about her mother that had clearly caught Lady Beatrix off guard. If he had recognized her mother's portrait somewhere, if he had some reason of his own to be curious about the connection between Isabel Marchant and the Thornfield family, then perhaps he was not simply a chance visitor who had stumbled upon her by accident. Perhaps he already suspected something close to the truth Elinor had just discovered for herself. Back in her small room, Elinor sat by her window long into the night, staring out at the dark grounds of the estate, turning over the fragments of truth she had gathered. Her mother's marriage to Lord Thornfield, if true, changed everything about her place in this family, about the inheritance that had passed instead to Lady Beatrix and Clara after his death, about the years of hiding and shame that had defined her entire life. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things, and Elinor understood, even in her exhaustion, that her aunt would fight fiercely to keep the truth buried, just as she had buried it for nearly 2 decades already. Whatever came next, Elinor knew she could not face it alone. Her thoughts returned, again and again, to the Duke of Wardour, and the strange, quiet certainty in his eyes when he had asked about her mother, as if he already knew more than he had said. She did not know when she would see him again, or whether he intended to return to Thornfield Manor at all. But she found herself hoping, with an intensity that surprised her, that their paths would cross again soon, before her aunt found some way to bury this truth so deeply that even a duke's determination could not dig it free. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with fragmented dreams of her mother's soft brown eyes and the fading ink of a marriage certificate that promised a life Elinor had never known she was owed. 3 days passed after the confrontation in the attic, and in that time Elinor noticed a change in her aunt that unsettled her more than open anger ever could have. Lady Beatrix had grown quiet, almost calculating, watching Elinor across the dinner table with an expression that gave nothing away. She asked no more questions about the trunk or its contents, made no further threats about withdrawing her support, and this silence, more than anything, filled Elinor with a deep sense of unease. She was not wrong to feel it. On the 4th morning she woke to find Hannah standing at the foot of her bed, her face pale and troubled, a bundle of traveling clothes folded over her arm. "What is this?" Elinor asked, sitting up quickly, confusion clouding her sleepy mind. "Lady Beatrix's orders, miss," Hannah said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You're to pack your things. A carriage is being arranged for tomorrow morning." "Pack for what? Where am I going?" Hannah hesitated, twisting the fabric in her hands. "I heard her telling Mr. Prescott, the estate manager, that you're to go stay with a distant relation in the north, someone she called Cousin Agatha. I don't know more than that, miss. Truly I don't." Elinor's stomach dropped. She had never heard of any Cousin Agatha in her life, and the sudden urgency of the arrangement, the way it had been decided without a single word to her directly, told her everything she needed to know about her aunt's true intentions. This was not a visit. This was banishment, dressed up as family obligation, meant to remove her from Thornfield Manor before the truth she had discovered in the attic could grow into something her aunt could no longer control. "Thank you, Hannah," Elinor said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "You may go." Once alone, Elinor sat frozen on the edge of her bed, her mind racing through the limited options available to her. She had no money of her own, no way to reach the Duke or anyone else who might help her, and no proof beyond her own memory of what she had seen in that trunk, since she had left the documents behind in the attic that night, too frightened to take them with her. She needed those documents now, more than ever, if she was to have any hope of proving what she had learned. That evening, after the house had settled into its usual quiet, Elinor made her way once again to the attic stairs, moving as silently as she could manage, her heart pounding with the knowledge of how much greater the risk felt this time. If her aunt caught her a second time, there would be no quiet conversation, no threats delivered with icy control. There would only be the certainty of tomorrow's carriage, carrying her away before she could gather anything that might help her. The attic was as dark and dusty as before, and Elinor moved quickly toward the corner where the trunk had stood, her small candle casting nervous shadows across the sloped ceiling. But when she reached the spot, her heart sank into cold dread. The trunk was gone. She searched the corner frantically, moving aside covered furniture and old boxes, but there was no sign of it anywhere. Her aunt must have moved it, or destroyed it entirely, in the days since their confrontation. Whatever proof of her mother's marriage had once existed in that small wooden trunk was now beyond her reach, hidden or burned or locked away somewhere Elinor had no hope of finding before tomorrow's carriage arrived to carry her away. She sank down onto an old chest, despair settling heavily over her shoulders. Without proof, she was simply a girl with a story no one would believe, a niece who had overstepped her bounds and imagined a grander truth than the plain facts of her existence. Her aunt held every advantage, every piece of power, and tomorrow, Elinor would be sent far away to a distant relation she had never met, likely never to return to Thornfield Manor or to whatever truth remained buried within its walls. A sound at the attic door made her freeze once more, her candle wavering in her trembling hand. But it was not Lady Beatrix who stepped through the doorway this time. It was Clara, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, her expression a mixture of guilt and determination that Elinor had never seen on her cousin's face before. "I thought I might find you here," Clara said quietly, closing the door behind her. "Mother had the trunk moved to the locked cellar beneath the east wing 2 days ago. I helped carry it, though I didn't know then what was inside." "You know now?" Elinor asked carefully. Clara nodded, guilt flickering across her face. "I looked after, I shouldn't have, but I did." She hesitated, twisting the edge of her shawl in her fingers. "Elinor, if what's in that trunk is true, then everything is different than what I've always believed. About the house, about my own place here." "I never wanted to take anything from you, Clara," Elinor said softly, and she meant it, though the words felt strange coming from a girl who had spent her entire life being told she had no claim to anything at all. "I know that," Clara said, "but Mother is frightened, truly frightened, and frightened people do foolish things. Sending you away tomorrow isn't about protecting the family, Elinor. It's about protecting her position, and mine, whatever she tells herself about doing it out of duty." Elinor studied her cousin carefully, unsure whether to trust this sudden shift in loyalty, though something in Clara's expression seemed genuine, even urgent. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "Because it isn't right, what she's done to you, keeping you hidden all these years, and now trying to send you away before the truth can come out. I may not have always been kind to you, Elinor, but I'm not so cruel that I can watch this happen without saying something." "Can you get me into the cellar?" Elinor asked, hope flickering weakly against the despair that had settled over her only moments before. Clara shook her head quickly. "Mother keeps the only key on a chain around her own neck now. There's no getting to that trunk without her knowledge, not before tomorrow morning." She paused, chewing her lip thoughtfully. "But there might be another way. The Duke of Wardour has been asking questions in the village, according to what I overheard from Mr. Prescott. Questions about old marriage records at the parish church, and about a woman who used to be the Thornfield housekeeper before I was born, someone who might remember more than the servants here now are willing to say." Elinor's heart lifted at this news, though it did little to solve her immediate problem. "That may help eventually, but I'm to be sent away tomorrow morning, Clara. Whatever the Duke discovers, it will be too late to stop the carriage." Clara was quiet for a moment, clearly turning something over in her mind, before she spoke again with a determination that surprised them both. "Then we need to delay the carriage," she said. "Or find a way to reach the Duke before it leaves." "How?" Elinor asked. though a small, fragile hope had begun to take root in her chest for the first time since Hannah had appeared at her bedside that morning with news of her banishment. "Leave that to me," Clara said, and for the first time in all their years living beneath the same roof, Elinor saw something like true kinship pass between them, a bond neither of them had ever expected to share. They descended from the attic together, parting ways in the quiet hallway with a shared understanding that neither of them fully knew what the coming hours would bring. Elinor returned to her room and began, with trembling hands, to pack the small bag she had been given, though her mind remained fixed on the possibility Clara had offered her. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake listening to every sound the old house made, every creak of settling wood and distant call of night birds outside her window, wondering whether Clara would truly find a way to help her, or whether tomorrow morning would arrive exactly as her aunt had planned, carrying her away from Thornfield Manor, and everything she had only just begun to uncover about her own history. As dawn approached, gray light creeping slowly across the sky outside her window, Elinor heard the sound of a carriage being prepared in the drive below, the clatter of hooves and harness carrying clearly through the still morning air. Her stomach tightened with dread. Whatever Clara had planned, if she had managed anything at all, there was no sign of it yet, and the carriage that would carry Elinor away seemed only moments from departure. She dressed slowly, delaying as long as she reasonably could, though she knew delay alone would not be enough to stop what her aunt had set in motion. When Hannah came to fetch her a short while later, her face was tight with a nervous energy that suggested even the maid understood something significant was unfolding beneath the surface of this ordinary morning. "The carriage is ready, miss," Hannah said quietly. "Lady Beatrix is waiting downstairs." Elinor picked up her small bag, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and stubborn hope, and followed Hannah down the stairs toward whatever awaited her in the front hall, unaware that Clara, true to her word, had already sent word racing across the countryside toward Wardour House, praying it would arrive in time to change the course of the morning entirely. The front hall was cold and gray in the early morning light when Elinor descended the stairs, her small bag clutched tightly in her hand. Lady Beatrix stood waiting near the door, dressed as impeccably as always, her expression composed into something that might have passed for concern to anyone who did not know her well. "You will write to me once you've settled with Cousin Agatha," Lady Beatrix said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth she reserved for moments when servants or outsiders might be listening. "The journey north is long, but the coachman knows the route well. You'll be perfectly safe." Elinor said nothing, unable to summon words of gratitude for a kindness she knew was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. She allowed her aunt to guide her toward the front door, toward the waiting carriage she could see through the tall windows, its horses already stamping impatiently in the cold morning air. They stepped outside together, and Elinor felt the chill of the morning settle into her bones as she walked toward the carriage that would carry her away from everything she had only just begun to understand about her own past. The coachman, a stranger she did not recognize, moved to help her inside, and Elinor cast one last glance back at the house, wondering if she would ever see it again. It was then that she heard it, the sound of hooves approaching quickly along the drive, moving at a pace far faster than the careful, measured arrival of a typical morning visitor. Lady Beatrix heard it too, her composure flickering for just a moment before she turned to see who was approaching with such urgency. A single rider came into view first, his horse lathered with sweat, clearly having ridden hard through the early morning hours. Behind him, moments later, a fine black carriage appeared, moving with far less haste but no less purpose, and Elinor's heart leapt as she recognized it immediately. The Duke of Wardour had come. Lady Beatrix's face drained of color as the carriage drew closer, and Elinor understood in that instant that whatever message Clara had managed to send in the darkness of the previous night had found its way to Wardour House, and had been answered with a speed that spoke of genuine urgency. The Duke's carriage rolled to a stop, and he stepped down before it had even fully halted, his expression grim and determined in a way Elinor had not seen during his earlier visit. He crossed the distance between them quickly, his eyes moving from Eleanor's small traveling bag to the waiting carriage behind her, understanding the situation at a glance. "Lady Beatrix," he said, his voice carrying an edge of controlled anger that made even the coachman shift uneasily. "I understand your niece is departing this morning, rather suddenly, for the north." "A family matter, your grace," Lady Beatrix said quickly, though her voice trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "Nothing that need concern you." "On the contrary," the Duke said, "I find that it concerns me a great deal, particularly given certain matters I have been investigating these past several days." He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening slightly as he addressed her directly. "Miss Eleanor, would you permit me a few moments of your aunt's time before this carriage departs? There are things that must be discussed, and I believe you have as much right to hear them as anyone." Eleanor nodded, unable to trust her voice, and the small group moved back toward the house, Lady Beatrix's protests growing increasingly weak as she realized the futility of resisting a duke's determined request. They gathered in the drawing room where, weeks before, Eleanor had first been discovered behind the very curtain meant to conceal her, and the Duke wasted no time in laying out what he had learned. "I have spent the past several days making inquiries," he began, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, his bearing commanding despite the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "At the parish church nearest this estate, I located a record of marriage between Isabel Marchant and Edmund Thornfield, dated some 19 years ago. I also located a woman named Mrs. Whitfield, formerly the housekeeper of this house, now retired to a cottage in the village, who confirmed that marriage in considerable detail." Lady Beatrix's face had gone entirely pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, though she said nothing to contradict him. "Mrs. Whitfield informed me," the Duke continued, "that Isabel Marchant was a woman of modest means, the daughter of a local physician, whom Lord Edmund Thornfield married secretly against the wishes of his own family, who considered the match unsuitable given her lack of fortune or noble connection. The marriage was kept quiet, known only to a handful of trusted servants, until Isabel's death shortly after giving birth to a daughter." Eleanor's breath caught. She had suspected as much from the marriage certificate she had found, but hearing it confirmed so plainly, spoken with such certainty by a man who had taken the trouble to investigate the truth on her behalf, struck her with a force she had not expected. "That daughter," the Duke said, turning his gaze fully to Eleanor now, "was, of course, yourself." "This is preposterous," Lady Beatrix interjected sharply, finding her voice at last. "Old servant gossip and faded paperwork prove nothing, your grace. Whatever Mrs. Whitfield believes she remembers from nearly 2 decades past cannot be relied upon as fact." "I would agree with you," the Duke said calmly, "were it not for the marriage certificate itself, which Mrs. Whitfield informs me was kept in this very house for many years, along with certain letters between Lord Thornfield and his young wife. Documents which, I understand, may have recently come into Miss Eleanor's possession, however briefly." Lady Beatrix's eyes flashed toward Eleanor, understanding immediately what had happened, though she said nothing further to accuse her directly. "There is also," the Duke continued, reaching into his coat and withdrawing a folded paper, "the matter of Lord Thornfield's original will, drafted some months after Isabel's death, in which he formally acknowledges his infant daughter as his legitimate heir, entitled to inherit Thornfield Manor and its lands upon reaching the age of 18, with provisions for her guardianship in the interim to be managed by his sister, Lady Beatrix, until that time." The room fell into stunned silence. Eleanor stared at the folded paper in the Duke's hand, hardly daring to believe what she had just heard. She was 18 years old. She had turned 18 only months before, a birthday that had passed at Thornfield Manor with no acknowledgement or celebration at all, as it had every year before it. "Where did you find that will?" Lady Beatrix demanded, her composure finally shattering entirely, her voice rising with something close to panic. "Filed with a solicitor in London some 19 years ago," the Duke said evenly, "where it has remained, largely forgotten, until my own solicitor located it during the course of this investigation. I understand a different will was presented to the court following Lord Thornfield's death, one that made no mention of a daughter at all, and that named yourself as the primary beneficiary of the estate. That will was entirely legitimate, Lady Beatrix said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. Perhaps, the Duke said, though I suspect a court would take considerable interest in comparing the signatures on both documents, given that the earlier will was properly witnessed and recorded, while the later one, I understand, was witnessed only by servants who have since left your employment, and who have proven remarkably difficult to locate for testimony. Elinor watched her aunt's face carefully throughout this exchange, watching the careful mask she had worn for so many years finally begin to crumble under the weight of evidence she could no longer dismiss or explain away. For the first time in Elinor's memory, Lady Beatrix looked genuinely afraid, not of losing an argument, but of losing everything she had spent nearly 2 decades building on a foundation of deception. You would ruin this family over old papers and the ramblings of a forgotten housekeeper, Lady Beatrix said, though the fight had largely gone out of her voice. I would see justice done for a young woman who has spent her entire life hidden away in her own family home, denied even the knowledge of who her own parents were, the Duke replied, his voice firm but not unkind. Whatever ruin follows, Lady Beatrix, you have brought upon yourself through your own choices, made many years before I ever arrived at this house. Elinor found her voice at last, though it trembled with the weight of everything she was learning in this single, overwhelming conversation. Why? She asked, looking directly at her aunt for the first time without the careful deference she had always maintained. Why hide me away instead of simply telling me the truth? Even if you wanted to keep the inheritance for yourself and Clara, why not simply tell me who I was? Lady Beatrix's composure cracked further, something almost like genuine grief flickering across her features before she forced it back down beneath her usual cold control. Because the moment anyone learned the truth, everything would be lost, she said quietly. Not just the house, but Clara's future, her prospects for marriage, everything I had built to secure her place in society. You were a threat to all of it, Elinor, from the moment you were born, and I made the only choice I believed I could make to protect what remained of this family. By hiding your own niece as though she were something shameful, Elinor said, the years of quiet hurt finally finding voice. By letting me believe I had no family at all, no history, no right to anything, when the truth was there all along, buried in an attic trunk you hoped I would never find. The room fell silent again, heavy with everything that had finally been spoken aloud after so many years of careful concealment. The Duke moved quietly to stand beside Elinor, close enough that she felt a measure of steadiness return to her trembling frame simply from his presence. This matter will need to be settled properly, through the courts, with the will and marriage records I have gathered presented as evidence, the Duke said, addressing Lady Beatrix directly now. I would advise you to seek your own legal counsel promptly, though I suspect you already understand the strength of the case against the will currently governing this estate. Lady Beatrix said nothing, staring at some point on the carpet between them, her entire world visibly collapsing around the careful lies she had maintained for so long. Clara, who had entered the room quietly at some point during the conversation, moved to her mother's side, though her expression suggested she felt little sympathy left to offer. For now, the Duke continued, turning back to Elinor with a gentleness that stood in sharp contrast to the firmness he had shown her aunt. I would ask that you not board that carriage this morning, Miss Elinor. You are under no obligation to travel anywhere against your will, and certainly not to a relation you have never met, arranged in such haste as this journey clearly was. Where would I go instead? Elinor asked softly, aware that even with the truth finally revealed, the practical matters of her life remained deeply uncertain. My own aunt, Lady Margaret Wardour, would be honored to host you at Wardour House, while these legal matters are properly settled, the Duke said. She is a woman of impeccable reputation, and your presence there would raise no questions of propriety, given the circumstances I intend to explain to her in full. Elinor looked toward her aunt one final time, searching for some remaining trace of the woman who had, despite everything, provided her with a roof and food and shelter for 18 years, however grudgingly given. She found only exhaustion and defeat in Lady Beatrix's downturned eyes, and something in Elinor softened slightly, even amid the anger she still carried. "I do not wish to see this family destroyed," Elinor said quietly, addressing both her aunt and the Duke. "But I will not go on hiding either, pretending I am someone I am not, simply to preserve a lie that has already caused so much harm." "No one is asking you to hide any longer, Miss Elinor," the Duke said gently. "Quite the opposite." With that, the small procession moved toward the door, Elinor leaving behind the carriage that had been meant to carry her away to obscurity, and stepping instead toward the Duke's own carriage, and toward a future she was only beginning to understand might finally, truly, belong to her. Wardour House stood on a rise overlooking a wide valley, larger and grander than anything Elinor had ever imagined a home could be, with tall windows that caught the morning light and gardens that stretched further than she could see from the carriage window. As they approached along the long drive, Elinor felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief settle over her, as though she had stepped from one life into an entirely different one within the span of a single morning. Lady Margaret Wardour met them at the door, a tall, elegant woman with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that studied Elinor with open curiosity, rather than the wary suspicion she had grown accustomed to at Thornfield Manor. The Duke had clearly sent word ahead, for Lady Margaret greeted her with a warmth that suggested she already understood a great deal about the situation. "My dear girl," Lady Margaret said, taking Elinor's hands in her own, "you must be exhausted. Come inside and we shall have tea brought immediately. My nephew has explained enough of the circumstances that I understand you have had a most difficult morning." Elinor allowed herself to be led inside, into a house that felt warm and welcoming in ways Thornfield Manor never had, despite its much grander size. She was given a room of her own, far larger and finer than the small chamber she had occupied for 18 years, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something like safety settle over her. But the matter of her inheritance remained far from settled, and over the following days, Elinor found herself drawn into a world of solicitors and legal documents she barely understood, as the Duke worked tirelessly to secure the proof needed to establish her rightful claim to Thornfield Manor. Mr. Doyle, the solicitor who had located the original will, arrived at Wardour House 3 days after Elinor's arrival, carrying with him a leather case full of documents that he spread carefully across the long table in the library. Elinor sat beside the Duke, trying to follow the careful legal language as Mr. Doyle explained the case that had been built. "The original will, properly witnessed and filed with my office 19 years ago, clearly names you as Lord Thornfield's legitimate heir," Mr. Doyle explained, tapping the aged document before him. "The later will, presented to the court following his death, differs significantly in its provisions and, I regret to say, shows signs of having been altered after the fact." "Altered how?" Elinor asked. "The signature, while a reasonable approximation of Lord Thornfield's hand, does not match precisely when compared against other verified documents from the same period," Mr. Doyle said. "I have consulted with a specialist in such matters, who confirms my own suspicions. It is my professional opinion that the later will was forged, likely with the assistance of someone within the household who had access to genuine examples of Lord Thornfield's signature." Elinor thought immediately of the letters she had glimpsed in the attic trunk, letters written in Lord Thornfield's own hand to her mother, letters that would have provided exactly the kind of sample needed to forge a convincing signature. She wondered with a chill whether those very letters had been used to construct the lie that had shaped her entire life. "What happens now?" Elinor asked, looking between the solicitor and the Duke. "We present our evidence to the court," Mr. Doyle said. "Given the strength of what we have gathered, including Mrs. Whitfield's testimony and the marriage certificate itself, I am confident the court will rule in your favor. Thornfield Manor, along with its lands and remaining income, will be restored to you as Lord Thornfield's rightful heir." It should have felt like a victory, and in many ways it did, but Elinor also felt the weight of what this meant for Lady Beatrix and Clara, women who had raised her, however coldly, and who now stood to lose everything they had built their lives around. She said as much to the Duke later that evening, as they walked together through the gardens behind Wardour House, the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. "I understand your concern," the Duke said thoughtfully, "though I would remind you that whatever happens to your aunt and cousin now is the result of choices your aunt made many years ago, not choices you are making today. You are simply seeking the truth and the life that was always meant to be yours." "I know," Elinor said quietly, "and yet I cannot help but think of Clara, who never asked to benefit from a lie she did not create. She helped me in the end when it mattered most. I would not see her cast into poverty for her mother's choices." The Duke was quiet for a moment, considering her words with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "once your claim is properly established, you might choose to show your cousin a measure of generosity she did not extend to you. It would be entirely within your rights, once the estate is yours, to provide for her future in whatever way you see fit, regardless of the court's ruling regarding your aunt." Elinor considered this, something settling more peacefully in her chest at the thought. It was not forgiveness, not entirely, not yet. But it was the beginning of a path forward that did not require her to become as cold and calculating as the woman who had raised her. They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, the evening air cool and fragrant with the scent of late summer flowers, before the Duke spoke again, his voice carrying a note of hesitation she had not heard from him before. "Elinor," he said, using her given name without title for the first time since they had met, "I confess my interest in this matter, while genuinely rooted in seeking justice on your behalf, has grown into something rather more personal over these past weeks." Elinor's heart quickened, though she said nothing, waiting to hear what he meant to say. "When I first saw you," he continued, "hidden behind that curtain in your aunt's drawing room, I felt an immediate curiosity I could not fully explain, beyond the resemblance to a portrait I had once seen of your mother, many years ago, when I was still a young man and Lord Thornfield had shown it to me with such evident pride and love. But as I have come to know you these past weeks, that curiosity has become something far deeper." "Your Grace," Elinor said softly, uncertain how to respond to words she had not expected to hear, though her heart raced with a hope she barely dared to acknowledge. "Alaric," he corrected gently. "Please, when we are alone together, I would have you call me by my name." "Alaric," she repeated, testing the sound of it, feeling something warm bloom in her chest at the intimacy of the moment. "I do not know what to say to what you have shared with me. My life has changed so entirely in these past weeks, I hardly know who I am from one day to the next." "You need not say anything now," Alaric said, though he took her hand gently in his own as they continued their walk through the darkening garden. "I only wished you to know my feelings, so that whatever happens with the estate and the court's decision, you understand my interest in your welfare extends far beyond mere obligation or curiosity." Elinor allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel the warmth of a moment without immediately questioning what it might cost her later. They walked together until the last light faded from the sky, and though nothing more was said of feelings or futures that evening, something had shifted between them, a quiet understanding that neither of them needed to name aloud just yet. The following weeks passed in a steady rhythm of legal proceedings and careful preparation. Mrs. Whitfield traveled from her cottage in the village to give formal testimony before the court, her memory of Isabel Marchant's secret marriage to Lord Thornfield clear and detailed despite the years that had passed. The marriage certificate and original will were examined by court officials and confirmed authentic, while the specialist Mr. Doyle had consulted, testified confidently regarding the forgery evident in the later document. Lady Beatrix, for her part, retained her own solicitor and mounted what defense she could, though the evidence against her grew more overwhelming with each passing week. Elinor heard little directly from Thornfield Manor during this time, though Clara sent occasional brief letters, careful and guarded but no longer entirely without warmth, describing the tense atmosphere that had settled over the house as the court date approached. Elinor found herself growing stronger with each passing day at Wardour House, guided by Lady Margaret's gentle instruction in matters she had never been taught, from managing household accounts to the subtler arts of navigating polite society. She had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of such knowledge, hidden away as though she had nothing to offer the world, that she approached each new lesson with a hunger that pleased and touched her hosts in equal measure. Alaric remained a steady, quiet presence throughout these weeks, visiting often, though always with the proper courtesy that Lady Margaret's household demanded. Their conversations grew longer and more comfortable with each visit, ranging from matters of the estate to simpler things, books they had both read, places he had traveled that she had only ever imagined from the confines of her small room at Thornfield Manor. It was during one such conversation, held in the library at Wardour House on a rainy afternoon some weeks after her arrival, that word finally came from Mr. Doyle regarding the court's decision. Elinor was seated near the fire, a book forgotten in her lap, when Lady Margaret entered with a letter in hand, her expression carefully composed, though Elinor could sense the importance of whatever news it contained. "It has arrived," Lady Margaret said, holding out the letter. "The court's ruling." Elinor's hands trembled as she took the letter, breaking the seal with careful fingers while Alaric moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring as she unfolded the paper and began to read. The words swam before her eyes at first, formal legal language that took a moment to fully register, before the meaning became clear. The court had ruled in her favor. The original will was recognized as valid, the later document confirmed as forged, and Thornfield Manor, along with all its lands and income, was formally restored to Elinor as the legitimate daughter and rightful heir of the late Lord Edmund Thornfield. She was, as of this moment, mistress of Thornfield Manor. The letter fell from her trembling hands, and she looked up to find both Lady Margaret and Alaric watching her with expressions of quiet joy, waiting to see how she would receive news that had been so long in coming, after a lifetime of hiding in shadows and curtains and small, forgotten rooms. "It's true," Elinor whispered, hardly able to believe the words even as she spoke them. "It's finally true." "It was always true," Alaric said gently, taking her hand once more. "You simply had not yet been given the chance to claim it." Elinor allowed herself, at last, to weep, though these were not tears of the sorrow that had defined so much of her life, but tears of a relief so profound it left her trembling long after the initial shock had passed. She had spent 18 years believing herself unwanted, hidden away as a shameful secret, and now, in a single letter, that entire foundation of belief had been proven false. She was Elinor Thornfield, daughter of Isabel Marchant and Edmund Thornfield, rightful mistress of an estate that had always, truly, belonged to her. The return to Thornfield Manor came 2 weeks later, and Elinor found herself standing once more before the tall front doors of the house that had both sheltered and imprisoned her for 18 years, though this time she arrived not as a hidden niece slipped quietly through servants' entrances, but as its rightful mistress, with Alaric at her side and Mr. Doyle following behind with the formal documents that would make the transition official. Word of the court's decision had already reached the household staff, and they gathered in the front hall to greet her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cautious welcome. Mrs. Ferris stood among them, her weathered face breaking into a wide smile the moment she caught sight of Elinor, and the cook stepped forward without hesitation to embrace her, an act of familiarity that would have been unthinkable only weeks before. "I always knew there was truth in the old stories," Mrs. Ferris said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm only sorry I couldn't say more back when it might have helped you sooner." "You helped more than you know," Elinor assured her, squeezing the older woman's hands warmly. Lady Beatrix and Clara waited in the drawing room, having been informed of Elinor's arrival and the purpose of her visit. Elinor found her aunt greatly changed from the composed, commanding woman who had ruled this house with such firm control for so many years. Lady Beatrix sat stiffly in her chair, her face pale and drawn, the weight of the court's ruling clearly having taken its toll on her in the weeks since the decision was announced. "I suppose you have come to see us removed from the house," Lady Beatrix said, her voice carrying none of its former sharpness, only a tired resignation that Elinor found she took no satisfaction in witnessing. "I have come to discuss the future," Elinor said, taking a seat across from her aunt while Alaric remained standing near the window, present, but allowing Elinor to lead this difficult conversation herself. "The court has ruled, and Thornfield Manor is now legally mine. That much cannot be changed. But what happens next is a matter I intend to decide for myself, not simply according to what the law permits." Clara looked up sharply at this, a flicker of hope crossing her features that she quickly tried to suppress, as if afraid to trust in kindness after everything her family had done to deny it to others. "I do not intend to see either of you cast out into poverty," Elinor continued, choosing her words carefully. "Aunt Beatrix, you will not remain mistress of this house, that much must be understood clearly between us. But I have arranged, through Mr. Doyle, for a comfortable cottage on the edge of the estate to be made available to you, along with a modest income sufficient to live with dignity, though certainly not with the grandeur you have grown accustomed to." Lady Beatrix's composure finally broke, tears filling eyes that Elinor had rarely seen show such vulnerability. "Why would you show me such mercy?" she whispered, "after everything I have done to you?" "Because I spent 18 years hidden away in this house, believing myself unworthy of kindness," Elinor said quietly. "I will not become the kind of person who withholds it from others simply because I now have the power to do so. That is not the mistress I intend to be." Clara, who had remained silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Elinor, I never truly understood what you endured here, not until I helped you that morning with the letter to Alaric. I am sorry, more sorry than I know how to express, for every small cruelty and every silence I kept when I should have spoken." "You spoke when it mattered most," Elinor said gently. "That is not nothing, Clara. I have arranged for you to receive a proper settlement as well, enough to secure your own future, whether that means finding a suitable match or simply establishing your own independent household. I do not expect you to remain here unless you wish to." The generosity of these arrangements seemed to overwhelm both women, and for a long moment the drawing room fell silent except for the quiet sound of Lady Beatrix's careful, controlled weeping. Elinor watched her aunt with a complicated mixture of feelings, not quite forgiveness, but something adjacent to it, a recognition that continuing to carry the weight of old anger would serve no one, least of all herself. "I will need time to gather our belongings," Lady Beatrix said finally, some measure of her old composure returning as she straightened in her chair. "But I thank you, Elinor, for a kindness I know I did not earn." "See that it is done within the month," Elinor said, not unkindly, but with the firm authority of a woman who understood, for the first time in her life, that her word now carried real weight within these walls. "I intend to begin restoring this house properly, and I would prefer to do so without further delay." The following weeks brought a whirlwind of change to Thornfield Manor, unlike anything the old house had seen in decades. Elinor threw herself into learning the full scope of her new responsibilities, working closely with Mr. Prescott, the estate manager, to understand the lands and tenants that now fell under her care. She had the east hallway, long stripped of her mother's portrait, restored to its former state, commissioning a new painting based on the small portrait she had found in the attic trunk, ensuring that Isabel's face would once again grace the walls of the house she had once called home. Word of the dramatic revelation spread quickly through the county, carried by servants and neighbors eager to discuss the scandal that had unfolded at Thornfield Manor. Elinor found herself, for the first time in her life, the subject of considerable curiosity and interest, invitations arriving from families who had never before acknowledged her existence, now eager to make the acquaintance of the young woman whose story had captured the imagination of the entire district. She approached this sudden attention with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to everything else in her new life, accepting some invitations and politely declining others, slowly building relationships on her own terms rather than allowing herself to be swept along by curiosity that had nothing to do with genuine friendship. Alaric remained a constant presence throughout this transition, visiting Thornfield Manor regularly, offering guidance where it was welcomed and stepping back where it was not, always careful to respect the boundaries of a young woman finding her own footing in a world that had suddenly opened before her in ways she had never imagined possible. It was during one such visit, several weeks after Lady Beatrix and Clara had departed for their new, more modest circumstances, that Elinor found herself walking with Alaric through the same gardens where she had once hidden behind a curtain, watching a duke's carriage arrive with a curiosity she had not dared to fully acknowledge at the time. "You have transformed this place remarkably in such a short time," Alaric observed, glancing up at the house that now stood bright and welcoming in the afternoon sun, its windows thrown open to let in fresh air and light that had been kept shuttered for far too many years. "I am only beginning," Elinor said, though a quiet satisfaction warmed her voice as she surveyed the grounds that were, at last, truly hers. "There is still so much I wish to do, so many years of neglect to undo." "You need not do it alone," Alaric said, stopping beside her near the same window where she had once watched him arrive as a stranger, curious about a young woman kept carefully hidden from view. Elinor turned to face him, something in his tone catching her attention, a seriousness that told her whatever he meant to say next carried weight beyond mere pleasant conversation. "I have watched you these past months," he continued, "not merely reclaim what was rightfully yours, but do so with a grace and generosity that I confess has left me in considerable admiration. You could have cast your aunt and cousin into ruin, and no one would have blamed you for it. Instead, you chose mercy, even after everything you endured." "I did not want to become the kind of person who forgets kindness simply because power was placed in my hands," Elinor said softly. "That is precisely why I find myself unable to remain silent any longer," Alaric said, taking both her hands in his own, his expression earnest and open in a way she had rarely seen from him. "Elinor, from the moment I first glimpsed you behind that curtain, curious and frightened and hidden away as though you had nothing to offer this world, I felt drawn to you in a way I have never experienced before. That first curiosity has grown, over these months of watching you become the remarkable woman you were always meant to be, into something I can no longer contain within careful, proper words." Elinor's heart raced, hardly daring to hope for the words she sensed were coming, though every part of her had grown to trust and cherish this man who had, without ever meeting her, pulled back the curtain that had hidden her entire existence. "I love you," Alaric said simply, the words carrying more weight for their plainness than any elaborate declaration could have managed. "I have loved you, I believe, since long before I fully understood what I was feeling, and I find I can no longer imagine my future without you beside me." Tears gathered in Elinor's eyes, though these were tears of a joy so profound it left her momentarily unable to speak, standing in the same gardens where she had first learned, weeks before, of feelings he had not yet dared to name aloud. "I love you too," she whispered finally, the words simple and true and utterly transformative in the way they settled the last uncertain corner of her heart. "I have loved you since you first looked at me not as something to be hidden, but as someone worth seeing." News of the engagement between the Duke of Wardour and the newly established mistress of Thornfield Manor spread through the county with remarkable speed, carried on the same currents of gossip that had once whispered so cruelly about the hidden niece kept out of sight in her aunt's drawing-room. Now those same voices spoke with genuine admiration, marveling at the story that had unfolded, a young woman rising from years of quiet obscurity to claim both her rightful inheritance and the affection of one of the most respected men in the region. Elinor found the sudden shift in public perception strange at first, the same neighbors who had once looked past her without a second glance now eager to offer their congratulations and secure invitations to whatever celebrations might follow. She approached this attention with the same careful patience she had shown throughout her transformation, grateful for genuine kindness where she found it, but no longer desperate for approval from those who had shown her none when she needed it most. Lady Margaret Wardour took particular delight in the engagement, having grown genuinely fond of Elinor during the weeks she had spent at Wardour House, and she threw herself into the preparations for the wedding with an enthusiasm that left Elinor both touched and slightly overwhelmed by the scale of celebration being planned. "You must understand, my dear," Lady Margaret said one afternoon, as they reviewed lists of guests and arrangements in the Wardour House library. "My nephew has shown little interest in matters of the heart these many years, despite considerable pressure from every corner of society to secure a suitable match. To see him so genuinely happy, so entirely devoted, is a joy I did not expect to witness in my lifetime." Elinor smiled at this, though her thoughts drifted, as they often did in quiet moments, to how differently her life might have unfolded had that carriage not arrived at Thornfield Manor on an ordinary afternoon so many months before, had that curtain not billowed at precisely the moment it did, revealing her to a man who might otherwise have never known she existed at all. "I sometimes wonder," Elinor admitted, "whether I would still be hidden away in that small room had circumstances been only slightly different that day." "Fate has a curious way of finding its path," Lady Margaret said thoughtfully, "even when we ourselves cannot see the road ahead clearly. I believe some truths are simply too significant to remain buried forever, regardless of how carefully someone attempts to conceal them." The wedding preparations continued through the autumn months, and Elinor divided her time between Wardour House and Thornfield Manor, determined to see her own estate properly restored before she took on the additional responsibilities that would come with becoming Duchess of Wardour. She worked closely with the tenants on her lands, many of whom had suffered under years of neglect during Lady Beatrix's management, ensuring that cottages were properly repaired, and that the harvest, when it came, was fairly distributed among those who had worked hardest to bring it in. Mrs. Ferris remained at Thornfield Manor as head cook, now treated with the respect and warmth her years of quiet kindness had always deserved, and Hannah found herself promoted to a position of greater responsibility within the household, her loyalty during Elinor's most difficult days never forgotten. Clara wrote occasionally from the small but comfortable house she had established for herself in a nearby town, her letters growing warmer and more genuine with each passing month, describing a growing friendship with a local family, and eventually, the beginnings of a courtship with a gentleman of modest but respectable means, a match built on genuine affection rather than the calculated ambitions that had once governed every decision within the Thornfield household. Lady Beatrix, for her part, remained largely withdrawn in her cottage on the edge of the estate, though Elinor made a point of visiting occasionally, bringing news of the estate's progress and small gifts that spoke more of duty than warmth, though even this measured kindness seemed to soften something in the older woman over time. Their relationship would never be close, Elinor understood, the years of hurt too deep to fully heal, but it had settled into something civil, even occasionally gentle, a far cry from the cold commands and hidden curtains of her earlier years. As winter approached, bringing with it the date set for the wedding, Elinor found herself standing once more in the drawing-room at Thornfield Manor, though this time the space had been transformed entirely, bright and welcoming, filled with the portrait of her mother that now hung proudly where it had once been forbidden. She studied Isabel's gentle face, so similar to her own reflection, and felt a quiet gratitude settle over her, wishing her mother could have seen how far her daughter had come from those years of hidden obscurity. "She would be proud of you," Alaric said softly, entering the room to find her standing before the portrait, his voice carrying the same steady warmth that had first drawn her to him during those difficult early months. "I hope so," Elinor said, turning to face him with a smile. "I only wish she could have known the truth of her own marriage recognized, rather than buried away as though it were something shameful." "Perhaps," Alaric said, moving to stand beside her, "her legacy lives on most truly not in the recognition of old documents, but in the strength and grace of the daughter she left behind, who found the courage to claim her rightful place despite every obstacle set against her." Elinor leaned into him, grateful beyond words for the man who had first pulled back a curtain meant to keep her hidden forever, and in doing so, had set in motion the unraveling of every lie that had shaped her early years. Their wedding, held in the small parish church where her parents' marriage had first been secretly recorded so many years before, was a quiet, joyful affair, attended by those who had earned genuine places in Elinor's heart, rather than those who sought merely to be seen at a fashionable event. Mrs. Ferris wept openly throughout the ceremony, while Hannah beamed with pride from her seat among the household staff who had been invited to witness the occasion. Clara attended as well, her own gentleman companion at her side, offering Elinor a warm embrace after the ceremony that spoke of a friendship finally, genuinely restored between the cousins who had once shared only cold distance beneath the same roof. Lady Margaret Wardour cried happy tears throughout, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had never witnessed a more fitting match, while Mr. Doyle, who had worked so tirelessly to uncover the truth that made this day possible, stood quietly satisfied near the back of the small church, having played his own crucial part in a story that had unfolded far beyond the simple legal matter he had first been asked to investigate. As Elinor and Alaric emerged from the church as husband and wife, the winter sun breaking through gray clouds to cast bright light across the small gathered crowd, Elinor felt the last remaining shadows of her hidden childhood finally, fully lift from her shoulders. She was no longer the girl kept behind curtains, spoken of only in whispers, hidden away as though her very existence were a source of shame. She was Elinor Wardour now, duchess and mistress of two great estates, standing beside a man who had seen her, truly seen her. From the very first moment their eyes had met across a drawing room she had once believed she would never be welcome to enter. Life at Wardour House settled into a rhythm of quiet contentment in the months that followed, Elinor dividing her attention between her new responsibilities as Duchess and the ongoing restoration of Thornfield Manor, which she visited regularly, determined to see her childhood home flourish, rather than fall into the neglect it had suffered under her aunt's management. Tenants who had once struggled under indifferent oversight found in her a landlord who listened carefully to their concerns, who understood, perhaps better than most in her position, what it meant to be overlooked and forgotten. She established a small school on the Thornfield lands, open to the children of tenants and servants alike, remembering her own years of isolated learning and determined that no child under her care would grow up believing themselves unworthy of education or opportunity, simply because of the circumstances of their birth. Mrs. Ferris took great pride in providing meals for the school's students, while Hannah, now trusted with considerable responsibility, helped oversee its daily operations with a competence that surprised everyone who had once known her only as a nervous young maid. Alaric proved himself, as Elinor had come to expect, a steady and supportive partner in every endeavor she undertook, never once suggesting that her ambitions for Thornfield Manor should be set aside in favor of simpler domestic concerns, but rather encouraging her at every turn to pursue the vision she held for the estate and its people. It was nearly a year after their wedding, on a warm spring afternoon in the very gardens where he had first confessed his feelings for her, that Alaric shared news that brought their joy to an even fuller measure. Elinor was to become a mother, a piece of news that filled the entire household, from Lady Margaret to Mrs. Ferris to even Clara, writing excitedly from her own now settled life, with genuine celebration. Elinor found herself, in the quiet months that followed, often returning in her thoughts to that ordinary afternoon so long ago, when a carriage had arrived unexpectedly at Thornfield Manor, and a curtain had billowed at precisely the wrong moment, revealing a girl who had spent her entire life hidden away, unaware that the very man who discovered her would become the one to finally set her free. She understood now, with the clarity that only distance and healing could provide, that every difficult year of her hidden childhood had shaped her into a woman capable of showing genuine mercy to those who had wronged her, of building something lasting and good from the ashes of deception and cruelty. She had not simply reclaimed a house and a title. She had reclaimed her own worth, her own voice, her own place in a world that had once told her in every possible way that she did not belong, As she stood in the nursery being prepared for her coming child, sunlight streaming through windows that would never again be shuttered against curious eyes, Elinor felt a profound and settled peace fill her heart. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, she faced them now not as a hidden girl waiting to be discovered, but as a woman fully seen, fully known, and fully loved, standing at last in the light she had spent so many years believing was never meant for her. The Duke of Wardour, walking into the nursery to find his wife lost in thought beside the window, crossed the room to stand beside her, wrapping his arms gently around her shoulders as they looked out together over the grounds of the home that had once been the site of her deepest sorrow, and had become instead the foundation of her greatest joy. "What are you thinking of?" he asked softly, "standing here so quietly?" "Of curtains," Elinor said with a small, contented smile, "and how grateful I am that one of them was finally pulled back." The child arrived on a bright morning in early autumn. Nearly 2 years after the afternoon, a curtain had first betrayed Elinor's hiding place to a curious duke. A daughter, with dark hair like her father's, and eyes the same soft brown that had once looked out from a hidden portrait in an attic trunk. Elinor named her Isabel, after the mother she had known for so little time yet had come to understand so completely through the truth finally brought into the light. Word of the birth traveled quickly through both estates, and well-wishers arrived at Wardour House for weeks afterward, though none brought Elinor more quiet satisfaction than the arrival of a simple, carefully written letter from Lady Beatrix, offering congratulations with a warmth that would have seemed impossible only 2 years before. Elinor read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the small writing desk where she kept the few precious items that had survived from her earlier, hidden life. Not every challenge to her happiness had been resolved so gently, however. In the winter following little Isabel's birth, a distant cousin of the late Lord Thornfield, a man named Mr. Sedgwick who had never once visited the estate during Elinor's childhood, appeared at Thornfield Manor with a solicitor of his own, claiming that the original will Elinor had used to establish her inheritance contained an irregularity that might yet be challenged before a higher court. Elinor received the news with far less alarm than the announcement might once have caused her. She was no longer the frightened girl who had trembled before her aunt's commands, uncertain of her own worth or her place in the world. She was Duchess of Wardour, mistress of Thornfield Manor, and a mother determined to protect the legacy she intended to pass down to her own daughter. She met with Mr. Sedgwick herself, in the very drawing-room where her own fate had first been decided by the accidental movement of a curtain, and listened patiently as he outlined his claims, careful accusations wrapped in polite legal language, suggesting that the original will's provisions for guardianship had never been properly executed given Lady Beatrix's failure to formally accept the role before the document had been superseded by the forged version. "An interesting theory," Alaric said calmly, standing beside his wife with the same steady presence he had shown throughout every challenge they had faced together, though one that conveniently ignores the fact that Lady Beatrix did indeed act as Miss Elinor's guardian for 18 years, whatever her personal failings in that role may have been. "The law recognizes actions taken, Mr. Sedgwick, not merely documents signed." Mr. Sedgwick's confidence wavered slightly under this response, though he pressed on with his arguments for a while longer, clearly hoping that the mere threat of prolonged legal proceedings might frighten Elinor into some manner of settlement that would benefit his own modest fortune. "I have no intention of surrendering what rightfully belongs to my daughter," Elinor said firmly, when Mr. Sedgwick finally paused to gauge her reaction. "I would advise you, sir, to consider carefully whether pursuing this matter through the courts serves your interests, given the strength of the evidence Mr. Doyle has already established regarding my claim, and given that my husband's own considerable resources are entirely at my disposal, should this matter require further defense." The quiet steel in her voice, so different from the trembling uncertainty she had once carried through every conversation in this very room, seemed to give Mr. Sedgwick pause. He departed shortly afterward, and though his solicitor sent a few additional letters over the following months, the threatened legal challenge never materialized into anything more serious, the weakness of his claim evident to anyone who examined the matter closely. Elinor found, in the aftermath of this brief challenge, a renewed appreciation for how far she had traveled from the frightened girl hidden behind curtains and locked doors. She had learned to speak with confidence, to defend what belonged to her without hesitation, to trust her own judgment in matters both large and small. The transformation had not happened overnight, but through the steady accumulation of small victories, small moments of courage, that had gradually reshaped the very foundation of who she understood herself to be. Clara married her gentleman companion the following spring, a quiet, kind man named Mr. Ashworth who worked as a solicitor in the nearby town, and Elinor attended the wedding with genuine warmth, having watched her cousin grow into a woman far different from the careless girl who had once dismissed her existence with barely a second thought. Clara's own happiness, hard-won through her own quiet acts of courage during the darkest days of her mother's deception, brought Elinor a satisfaction she had never expected to feel toward the cousin who had once treated her with such casual disregard. Lady Beatrix's health began to decline gradually over the following years, the weight of her diminished circumstances, and the loss of the position she had once held so tightly settling heavily upon her aging frame. Elinor visited more frequently as her aunt's condition worsened, bringing little Isabel along on these visits despite some hesitation from Alaric, who worried the association might prove painful given everything Lady Beatrix had once done to hide Elinor away. But Elinor found, in these final years of her aunt's life, a strange and unexpected peace settling between them. Lady Beatrix, freed from the constant fear of exposure that had governed so much of her earlier cruelty, softened into someone almost gentle, delighting in her small great-niece's visits in ways she had never once shown toward Elinor herself during childhood. It was not the relationship Elinor might have wished for, had circumstances been different from the very beginning, but it was something real, something honest, built on the truth that had finally replaced years of careful deception. When Lady Beatrix passed peacefully in her cottage some 6 years after the court's original ruling, Elinor arranged for her burial in the small Thornfield family plot, beside the husband she had once, in her own complicated way, genuinely loved, even as she had spent years denying his true daughter the recognition she deserved. Elinor stood at the graveside with Alaric and Isabel, now old enough to understand something of loss, and felt no bitterness in this final act of family duty, only a quiet acceptance of the long, difficult journey that had brought them all to this moment. Thornfield Manor continued to flourish under Elinor's careful stewardship in the years that followed, its lands prosperous, its tenants well cared for, its halls filled with the laughter of children rather than the tense silence that had once defined its rooms. The small school Elinor had established grew into a respected institution known throughout the county, educating children from every corner of the estate regardless of their family's standing or circumstances of birth, a living testament to the values Elinor had carried forward from her own difficult beginnings. Isabel grew into a bright, curious child, encouraged from her earliest years to explore every corner of the house and grounds without restriction, never once made to feel that any room or window or garden path was forbidden to her. Elinor made certain, above all else, that her daughter would never spend a single day of her life hidden away behind curtains, believing herself unworthy of being seen. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the day's business had concluded, Elinor often found herself in the drawing room where her story had truly begun, standing before the portrait of her mother that hung once more in its rightful place, sometimes with Isabel beside her, sharing stories of the grandmother she would never meet but whose courage and quiet dignity had, in the end, shaped the entire course of the family's future. Alaric would often join her in these quiet moments, and together they would watch the evening light fade across the grounds of the estate that had once held so much sorrow, now filled instead with the steady, contented rhythm of a family finally, fully at peace. The curtain that had once hidden Elinor from the world hung still in that same drawing room, though it had long since lost its power to conceal anything at all, a simple piece of fabric that had, on one ordinary afternoon so many years before, changed the entire course of a hidden girl's life. She had been ordered to remain hidden, unseen, unheard, a secret too shameful to acknowledge before polite company. Instead, she had become Duchess of Wardour, mistress of Thornfield Manor, wife to a man who had loved her from the very moment he first saw past the curtain to the woman hidden behind it, and mother to a daughter who would never know what it meant to be told she did not belong. The girl once hidden away had, at last, stepped fully and permanently into the light, and there she remained for the rest of her long and contented life.